Hello everyone, this is Philippa Benson, the Managing Editor of CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access multidisciplinary journal. Today our webinar is about how to select a journal for submitting your manuscript. In this presentation I'll share some perspectives and advice about how to select a journal in a way that will give you the best possible chances to get your manuscript into review and eventually published. I like to begin with a reminder of starting each writing task by taking a high-level view of the full cycle of generating new knowledge in science, and keeping in mind the many different audiences that come into play and overlap through the research cycle. These audiences are stakeholders who are critical to professional success and should be kept in front of mind whenever possible. All writers, including scientists, often focus on only a subset of these audiences when engaged in a specific writing task, whether it is while compiling notes and ideas while conducting research, collaborating with others while drafting a manuscript, tailoring files and a cover letter in preparation to submit for a particular journal, revising manuscripts and responding to reviewer comments, engaging in post-publication activities with other researchers and the public, preparing new materials for presentations and professional meetings, and then developing new ideas for research, designing that research, generating a grant proposal, securing funding, and the many other writing tasks in between. It's authentically important to remember that all stakeholders will be impacted by the decisions you make throughout the research and publication process, whether directly or indirectly, sooner or later. So, when looking at your readers of your final manuscript, it's important also to think beyond those who are working to further define and solve similar questions to those that you're addressing. You also want to think about your broader set of colleagues and co-authors in your institution and other institutions and their concerns. Institutional leaders will also be critical audiences as they want to register your productivity as part of their community, and they can help you in promoting you and your work. These institutional players can also become involved if there are any questions related to the ethical practices or use of funds in your research or publishing. When it comes to the publication process, of course, you want to think about the editors and the editorial structures of journals you submit to, as well as to the publishers of those journals, making sure that they're transparent and committed to best practices and have access to the most advanced technologies for indexing and disseminating your content. You also want to think about your readers in the role of reviewers of your work, those experts who will assess the quality of your manuscripts and suitability for specific journals. You also need to think about the organizers of professional societies and their meetings that could highlight your new research and foster debate and discussion. You cannot, of course, forget funders as critical audiences, as they pay attention to where their funded authors publish and the attention given to the new research findings that they've bankrolled. Funders, along with publishers, want to make sure that grant recipients have met specific requirements that they may be putting in place, such as those related to submitting permanent identifiers for authors, for data, for institutions, as well as funding and publisher requirements for sharing data and materials. After you get published, you'll also need to think about the audiences involved in helping to get the word out to your professional networks and the public, perhaps through news and social media outlets. The point here is that you should be thinking about all these stakeholders, these audiences, throughout your entire research process. We almost have to begin a discussion about selecting a journal by talking about impact factor. Of course, everybody wants to get their journal their manuscript into the most impactful journal with the highest impact factor. But it's really important to remember that those journals are highly selective and also have high rejection rates. Submitting to journals with very high impact factors is not going to be a good use of your time unless, of course, you have a truly extremely important piece of work with a broad impact of important science that directly matches the aims and scope of the target high-impact publication. Today, there are many new journals being published, and because they are young publications, they may not even have an impact factor. However, this does not mean that they're not good journals, and they may in fact be very good journals. New journals are being started these days because there are so many new areas of science and so much more science being produced across the planet. These new journals may be very important outlets for your work and should be considered, even if they don't have an impact factor. So overall, impact factor is not a good idea to use as a measure for how to select a journal for submitting. What you do want to make sure is that the journal is included in important citation databases like the Web of Science or Scopus, and they evaluate journals to make sure that they're following best practices in both research and publishing. Once indexed in these databases, readers will be able to find your content. So my strong suggestion is that you put impact factor way down on your list of things to consider when you're selecting a journal. Before you begin the process of selecting an initial set of candidate journals to consider submitting to, I suggest that you take a big step back first and consider all the different audiences that are going to come into play throughout your research and publication cycle so that you are bearing them all in mind when you make your final selection. When you're considering selecting a journal, you may start with thinking about and focusing on a journal itself and the editors who will assess your manuscript. However, there are many other people involved throughout your process that will end up being influenced by and influencing the selection you make. You've got to consider your co-authors and colleagues, of course, who worked with you on the project that you are now trying to project. And you've got to make sure that they're all in agreement about the final journal you select to submit to. You also want to think about the reviewers who may be asked to assess your submission. Will those people be impacted by the reputation of the journal that's asking them to review? What is the status of the journal in that particular specialist community? You may also want to think about people who have funded your research, as they may have preferences or specifications for the kinds of journals in which the work they have funded is published. For example, these days, some funders require that you publish in an open access journal. Your institution may also have requirements related to the journals you can publish in. And you may want to think also about the publisher of the journal and how they disseminate information about the new papers that they have put out in various issues. You want to make sure that they get that information promoting your research out through news outlets to the public and to professional societies. So overall, the reputation of the publishers of specific journals can come into play. In other words, when you're getting ready to make a decision about what journal you're going to prepare and submit to, there are a lot of different people that you need to keep in mind. The importance of thinking about your journal selection in terms of all these different audiences will become more clear as we go through the webinar. A good first step when you're compiling a set of candidate journals to consider submitting to is to remember that every journal is different and unique, and you need to look at the specifics of each one as you're considering them. For example, think about the publisher of the journal. Is it a reputable and well-established publisher who can ensure that your work is properly produced and indexed so that readers can find your content? Does the journal have a professional staff that supports their editors and authors and reviewers? Does the publisher provide good marketing and promotion for the articles published in it? You're already familiar with many of the large publishing houses like Springer Nature, Elsevier, Wiley, as well as small and reputable publishers like CABI. If you're not immediately familiar with a publisher of a journal that you're considering, you should look into it to make sure that it's truly legitimate. Many predatory open access journal publications are put out by publishers that aren't particularly reputable. You also need to think about the editorial board of the publications that you're considering. Does the journal have academic, consulting, or reviewing editors? Those kinds of researchers who work, those kinds of editors who are researchers who have day jobs in universities or other institutions? Or does it have a staff of full-time professional editors? Or is the board a mixture of those two different kinds of editors? If the journal does have a board of academic editors, you should look and see if you recognize any of the names on those lists, which you can find on the masthead if it's a print journal, or online through the links to the editorial board and staff. It's certainly worth your time to look at the individuals on editorial boards to see if you can find something out about their backgrounds. And it's also good to look at the diversity of the editorial board, both in terms of gender and geographical diversity. Regardless of how diverse a board is, however, you should get a sense of who will be assessing your manuscript when you first submit it. Other differences among journals include the timing to decision and publication. How long is the average time for an article to go from submission to a first decision being made, or from submission through final publication? Most journals list these either on the first page of an article or the last page or on their website. Some authors may need to consider how quickly a particular journal publishes because they may need to complete a dissertation requirement. They may need a new publication to get a job or a promotion or tenure. Authors may need to get results published quickly, so they publish their work ahead of another competing group, or they may want to impact a policy decision. So you should look on the journal's website to see if it's transparent about the average review time. And if you can't find it, you should feel free to contact the editorial office and ask them to give you some information about that. Another difference among journals is access. Who can read the content where and when? Is the journal a subscription or pay-per-view model which will restrict editors, authors that don't have access through libraries? Is it open access, which has the advantage of allowing anybody to freely read the content? Or are there page charges or other kinds of fees for downloading or viewing? So you should look and consider how easy will it be for readers to access an article once it's published. And finally, another thing to consider is the peer review process. Some journals use single-blind review, where authors don't know the reviewers' names, but reviewers know who the authors are. Other journals use a double-blind process, where authors don't know who the reviewers are, and the reviewers also don't know who the authors are. And some journals are starting to use open peer review. This is where reviews are published alongside the article, and many times, but not always, the reviewers sign their names. And some journals have no peer review. This is the case sometimes with predatory open access journals that don't go through the steps of thorough, fast, fair, and rigorous peer review. Access to journals are a huge thing to consider when you're publishing. Who needs to get to the information that you are reporting on, and how quickly they need to do it. Regardless of the structure of a journal's editorial board or its publisher, all editors want some of the same things. They want manuscripts that fit the requirements for the scope and the length and the article types and other technical specifications that are detailed in the instructions to authors. They want to have complete, correct, and properly formatted texts, figures, tables, and reference lists. They want to have manuscripts that are free of errors and grammatical and readable. And very importantly, they also want to be working with authors who understand issues related to ethical issues in research and publishing, such as those promoted by the Committee on Publication Ethics, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and the Center for Open Science. If you're not familiar with these three organizations, you should go and visit their websites to understand their roles and the information they provide to authors and the scientific publishing community in order for there to be consistent and coherent science that is published, and make sure that people are working from the same standards and practices. Once you've got an idea about your target journals, about the reputation of the publishers, the structure and makeup of the editorial boards, the timing for publication, the access that readers would have, and the peer review processes used, there are a few other important questions that you should answer about the journal. Among the most important is, who are the readers of that journal? And a guideline you can use for selecting a journal is to see where the authors that you read, where they publish. Where did you draw your references from? Are there any particular journals that show up in your reference lists over and over? Might those be good target journals? These should be considered as top contenders for your manuscript. It's important to remember that new knowledge is built on existing knowledge. Once you've narrowed down the potential candidate journals that you may want to submit to, then you need to get into the details. You need to look at the aims and scope statement of each journal to make sure that the manuscript that you want to submit fits those aims and scope parameters. One of the primary reasons that manuscripts are rejected is because the submitted manuscript does not fit the aim and scope of the journal. You need to read those aims and scope statements very, very carefully and make sure that your manuscript is aligned with them. You also need to look at the types of papers that a journal publishes. Not every journal accepts all different kinds of papers. They may only accept some kinds. So you need to look and see what types of papers the journal accepts. Is it full research reports, short research reports, short communications, review papers, methods papers, commentaries, editorials? You should find on the journal website an explicit list of the kinds and types of papers that the journal will accept. You also need to look carefully at the limits that are stated to make sure that you can adjust your manuscript to fit those limits. Those include things like the number of words, the number of figures, tables, and how many citations are allowed. You also need to look at formatting requirements for images, tables, charts, figures, and that kind of thing. That's different than the number, how many. You also need to look at the formats that the journal will accept. You should also check and see what the style preferences are, both in terms of expository writing style. For example, does the journal prefer active voice? And also the style of citations that they want. What is the format for both the in-text and in-list citations? You should look carefully at other requirements specifically related to both depositing data in open repositories and also for sharing data and materials such as seeds or DNA samples. If you did a study, for example, on seeds of some kind and you have no more of those to share, then that might run you into difficulty when you're submitting to journals who require you to share materials if asked. So you need to look carefully at those requirements. Some journals have restrictions on the number of authors that are allowed, and there can be other restrictions or requirements, for example, on the size or complexity of supplementary materials. So all of these things you can find on the journal website, in particular in the instructions to authors, and also by looking at past issues and past published manuscripts. When you're considering a journal, be sure to check to see if there are page charges or color charges or open access fees. And if there are, and your funds are limited, you can feel free to reach out to the editorial office or specific editors and ask if there are grants or if there are lower fees, if you're from a certain country or you have economic hardship, if they will waive some of those fees. Many journals allow for that kind of thing, and there certainly is no harm in asking. Some journals, but not all, will accept pre-submission inquiries. You should be able to find in the instructions to authors or on the journal editorial policy pages if they do accept such inquiries. Each journal has different requirements for what they want in a pre-submission inquiry if they do take them. But usually they ask you to write a note to the editor that briefly states what your paper is about, what is new, what is important, and why that specific journal is a good match for your manuscript. Some editors will reply and some will not. But you should remember, if you do send in a pre-submission inquiry and you get encouragement to submit the manuscript, you need to remember that that is not a guarantee that the paper will be accepted or even that it will be reviewed. Remember again that every journal is different. You need to study each journal carefully and in particular make sure it's a good match with the aims and scope of the journal. If you get rejected from a journal, go through this entire process again to choose another journal. Be mindful that you will need to change the manuscript to fit the new journal because every journal is different. And be sure that you never send the exact same manuscript and cover letter to the next journal. There is no one size fit all. You have to tailor each submission to the specific journal that you are submitting to. Some authors ask me which comes first, picking the journal or developing the paper. And my answer to that is, this is really a chicken and egg problem. You can start in either part of the process, but certainly if you've done a review of candidate journals and narrowed it down, you'll have an easier time formatting a paper so that it fits the journal that you eventually end up choosing as your first top choice to submit to. To summarize, begin selecting the journals that you might submit to by creating a short list of journals that align with the topic of your manuscript. Your manuscript should match the journal aims and scope, and you should be sure that you can adjust your actual manuscript itself to fit the specific journal requirements. Then check each candidate journal to make sure that it has a reputable publisher, that it's transparent about its editorial board and review processes, that it lists the times that manuscripts move from submission to first decision and to publication, that it publishes the type of manuscript that you're submitting, and that it will be accessible to your target readers and has costs that you can afford. Once you've considered all these elements, you should be able to work with your colleagues to decide what is the best fit for your manuscript and then move ahead to submission. Before I let you go, I want to encourage you to visit CABI.org for information, publications, and education. In particular, please look at the journal CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access multidisciplinary journal, which is published in collaboration with BMC, which is the open access branch of Springer Nature. CABI Agriculture and Bioscience is led by an editorial board of top-ranking academic researchers from around the world. The journal is compliant with best practices in publishing for high-impact journal and is committed to publishing rigorously conducted science. We cover both primary and cross-disciplinary topics and accept manuscripts with findings both that have broad global impact and also research that is more narrow and has more specific implications and applications. We're committed to thorough, fast, and fair peer review. And again, the journal is open access with links to content on both the BMC and CABI websites. I also encourage you to visit AgriArchive, which is CABI's preprint server.
This is a free open access resource for unpublished preprint materials, manuscripts, about topics across all agriculture and biosciences. It's hosted and managed by CABI. There's no fee for submitting manuscripts to AgriArchive, and materials are posted within 72 hours after a quick review just for appropriateness of topic. The materials are not formally peer-reviewed, they're not edited or typeset in any way before being posted online. They're posted just as you submit them. And it is on AgriArchive that you will find an author education portal through which you will be able to link to more webinars like this one. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this presentation has helped give you some good ideas about how to select a journal for submission of your manuscript. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me at p.benson@cabi.org. Thank you.